Okay, so I assume probably for about 80% of all people who played tabletop RPGs, D&D was the first one they played. If that's true of you, raise your hand. Everybody? Yeah, okay. And I'll try to start with like a brief history, and I'm sure some of you experts can correct my mistakes. So as far as I know, publication and first sale of D&D was January of 1974. And originally it was sold strictly through a mail order service, basically. And so they sent out the first product in January. And it sort of gradually exploded and expanded since then. So you have your what we call original D&D. Originally were like 3 brown paper books, and I think the second printing was 3 white paper books.
Well, actually, it goes back a little farther than that.
Well, I'm talking about the D&D.
Well, you grew out of the magic and chainmail.
Well, I know, but I meant D&D as D&D.
Yeah, it was the 3 brown, and then later on was 3 whites.
Right, 3 brown, 3 whites, and I guess the brown covers didn't last very long, or they quickly switched to whites, as far as
I don't know. I still have my brown cover.
Oh, really?
So yeah.
Okay.
Wow. It's probably publishing switch or something.
Probably a printing thing.
Printing thing.
Yeah.
They were all in box sets, so
yeah.
it wasn't like it was that hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
the art was never real fancy.
So that's your what we'll call original D&D. And then I guess in '77, I think.
Just wanted to donate the fun and exciting door prize.
All right. It's Gord the Rogue by Gary Gygax, City of Hawks. And that's not the first of the Gord books. I don't know which one this is, to be honest, but it was written by Gygax. So anyway, I think it was in '77 or '78 that the first advanced Dungeons & Dragons book was published. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And at that point, you sort of had really, you could say, 2 different games, because you had the original game that was still being published in certain forms, and then you had Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and they coexisted for a number of years until you had, I don't remember the year, it might have been like '88, when you had Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition published. And I think, for you historians out there, you can correct me, what I'll call basic D&D sort of petered out around that time.
That's about when I dropped out of it, yeah.
Right. And then, so that's kind of like what was going on through the 90s.
When they launched D&D, the modern version, it had been the red box set and the blue box set, and then when they relaunched I think they did a relaunch of the red box too, and that's how a lot of people got into it. That was just basic D&D, was the red box.
And that would have been the early 80s, actually.
Right, that's right.
And they actually,
you're right, it petered out in the 90s.
They actually did another relaunch of it just a couple of years ago, but I'm getting ahead of us.
Okay. So, well, you mean, well, yeah, that's big.
Yeah.
Okay, so then in 2000, you have D&D 3rd edition. And then in 2003, you have 3.5.
Because 3.0 was born.
Well, okay. And then, let's see, what was the year for 4th edition?
2009.
Okay, 2009 was 4th edition.
Because that was the first D&D book I ever bought.
Okay, and then this summer,
At Gen Con.
in a couple, at Gen Con?
Yeah.
At Gen Con.
August 19th, I think.
So they're calling it D&D Next. Most people call it D&D 5th edition.
Right. Yeah.
Do they cue up a 60s pop song?
I don't know what they're going to do.
You have to be there to find out.
But that's sort of like the various editions that have existed. And I guess to me the interesting thing is that during the 80s you had really 2 different games. Well, I mean obviously similar, but substantially different that were coexisting at the same time. With some really wonky stuff left over from the original, like, okay, humans can choose a couple different classes, but an elf is just an elf, and a dwarf is just a dwarf.
A dwarf was a class in the original
Yeah,
D&D.
Yeah. So it didn't really have the concept of race and class, as it were. So that's kind of the overview of what's happened. So how about if...
If you really want to know about the early history of Dungeons & Dragons, I highly recommend this book, which you can get on a Kindle. It's much less heavy. This is 620 pages without including the appendices. of the actual history of wargaming and role-playing. Goes from the 14th century all the way up to basically the introduction of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons. The history of TSR, history of Gygax, how the game is designed, what its historical basis is, what its literary basis is, and why Gygax could say this wasn't based on Tolkien, even though Tolkien was in it. So anyways, it's well worth the read, but we're talking, this is a scholarly, small print, big pages. I'm just saying, it's taken me close to 6 months to read it. So, but if you want to know, that's the one to get. It's called Playing at the World by John Peterson, and I highly recommend it. And Ken, it's his book. Would you like your book back?
What? Sure.
He lent it to me.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, but as this gentleman pointed out, prior to D&D, the chainmail rules for miniatures, military miniatures gaming, included magical type stuff, right?
Right.
Which was the first time somebody had done that. And it got a great deal of bad press by the purists who were trying very, very hard to make all their miniatures combat realistic, with realistic effects. And someone says, and there's a fireball. Well, what are you going to do with that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it got started before the January '74 publication of original D&D. So perhaps we'll have our panelists, we'll start on the left, I guess, and just give us sort of like the story of your first D&D.
Well, I was in college, 1980, so it was advanced D&D version 1. I bought the player's guide from a hobby shop, which is probably the one place that sold it. And I was brought in by a couple of friends that were twin brothers. And we used to go to this guy and his wife's trailer and play like every Saturday until like 3 a.m. or whenever.
Wow.
And it was very interesting. We would spend a lot of time in school and talk about what we were going to do, for this next thing that we had coming up. I was, being lured by a succubus. What are you guys going to do? And we would do all this planning. We spent so much time talking about it. It was just incredible how you make friends and you can just strategize and have just a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And then I played in various groups over the years. I had one group where we played during lunch at work, several house groups, 3-5. I played a lot of 3-5 in the last 10 years. I've played a little bit of 4. It's okay. But I think the current game that I'm playing is Pathfinder. I kind of like Pathfinder. It's 3-5, but it's simpler.
Right.
0.75 or less.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there anybody here who doesn't know about Pathfinder? Okay.
No, I don't.
It's basically the company that sort of like extended from 3.5. When WotC published 4th edition, they said, okay, we want to still do 3.5, but we're going to improve it.
So Paizo.
They farmed it out.
Yeah. So Paizo is the company that formed, and they called it Pathfinder. And technically it is a different game. Technically it's not D&D, but it's very, very similar. If you want D&D and you play Pathfinder, you will get your fix.
Okay. Is that okay, Adam?
Well, my first exposure to role-playing was actually Gamma World.
Oh, Gamma
Jim
World.
Ward's.
You're off the panel.
I'm off the panel, sorry. Hey, it was TSR. It was a post-apocalyptic, I was around the time of the Road Warriors. To me, this whole post-apocalyptic thing was fascinating.
But they didn't have mutants.
No mutants. We don't call them mutants, we say magical.
Oh, okay.
Like the Marvel Universe now. It was mutants, and it was a DM in my middle school, and like you said, it's great. It's great for making friendships because you're working together to play this game. You get to know each other. It was really just very cool. And then someone who was part of that group introduced me to D&D and led me through my first module. I was at his house one time playing, and we went through it, and it was just the coolest experience ever with I can't remember specifics, but mazes, monsters, giant mushrooms, things like that. I thought was the coolest experience. And then I'm like, well, how did you come up with it? Well, this is the module itself. You introduced me to the concept of the modules.
Right.
It was exploration into the unknown, and then I read it, and it was like, there's nothing in it, and you find out that's the one where you have to like populate it with your own monsters.
Yeah.
So my first campaign I would never be able to read about it or create it again because it was something that came out of his imagination and a pre-formed dungeon that had been created. But I played mostly first edition in that time, some second edition, and I did start getting into other role-playing games, including some of the science fiction ones. Doctor Who, when FASA released theirs, it was a great way to take something you love, such as that series, and bring it to life in your own way. And I just remember spending hours making my own modules, making my own monsters. I had my own version of the monster manual, which probably sucked if I go back and read it now. Maybe not as much as Monster Manual 2, but anyway. And then much later, when I started teaching, I started running campaigns as part of a sci-fi club we ran, and I'll let Carter continue that story. So.
So for me, let's see, autumn of 1979, freshman in high school, I took a French class that first quarter, and a guy behind me had a copy of this book that had this big demon thing on it, and looked kind of interesting. Prior to that, of course, I had, growing up, my mom had read The Hobbit to me when I was like a little kid, and I'd read that, and I collected the Conan comic books. So I was into the fantasy genre before that. But seeing this book, I was fascinated by it, so I'd turn around him and ask him about it. This game, blah, 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 here's what it is. And so I guess that was the DMG, which actually has like an Ifrit on the front cover back then, right? Yeah, so that's what it was. And
Friends on the DM,
yeah. So I never actually, many years later I did play with that guy, but not right away. So I had to find somebody I basically had to search for Dungeons & Dragons to find out something about it. And somehow, I don't remember, I found out there was a game at some hobby store not too far from where I live. So I went there, and that was kind of like how I got involved. And back then, I guess around that time, I asked for the D&D basic set, the old Holmes Blue Book basic set, and I got that for Christmas and didn't really understand it. But I went to this hobby shop and played a little bit, and that's kind of how I got into it. And then sort of some furtive efforts here and there of not really knowing how to play the game with neighborhood kids and not really working out, and eventually figuring it out though.
Well, my first DM is actually sitting on this panel, so I have to say that my first time was awesome. But it was actually excellent. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, and we played the game just after class with Adam, who was one of our teachers, and he DM'd us through second edition. It was second edition.
I recall actually taking first edition when you guys threw it, because I wasn't into all the stuff that Wizards of the Coast did. It might have been some second edition stuff, but
okay.
Yeah.